Hi there, it's Ian Wright here, and this little podcast is called Babywhispering #1. The reason that I decided to do this podcast is that I've spent 25 years working with children and babies especially, and babies present with us a major problem because they can't talk to us. So they are crying, and we have to try and decipher why they're crying, and sometimes it can be very difficult. Now, I am not an authority on this, but I will give you some thought of my thoughts that I've developed with working with babies and children and having 3 of my own babies. The basics of this are: a baby is crying for normally one of 3 reasons. The first being hunger, the second that they're tired, or the third that they're in pain or they're not well. So we have to decipher really which of these is the problem to see if we can solve it, and often it's a combination of them, of course. So let's talk about hunger first of all. We tend to know when our baby's hungry because they have a certain character to their crying. It's very urgent. Some babies it's incredibly urgent. It builds. They don't settle down unless they're fed. Their tongue moves. They can grasp. It's settled by feeding. That's the way we know, because actually to relieve it, it's fed. This has to be differentially diagnosed, I think, with reflux, if it's to do with the diagnosis. But reflux, so a reflux baby cries because they're in pain, and if you feed them, if it's a silent acid reflux, the milk calms down the bottom of the esophagus, the top of the stomach, which has become acidic and irritable. And so what tends to happen in reflux is we tend to overfeed our babies. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. If a baby's tired, it's more of a whimpering cry. The eyes start closing. They wiggle around a little bit, and it tends to be fairly clear, I think. Not always, but they can be. Unfortunately, babies can be hungry and tired and in pain, and all of these things at once. And what we're trying to do here is to decipher the differences. Now, let's talk about when there are issues. I think the first thing is if they've got wind. Okay, this is a non-specific kind of irritability. They grind a little bit, they move their legs around, they drag their legs, their lips go tight at the bottom. If you wind them, it's relieved, and often there is a degree of stuck wind, trapped wind in a baby that's crying. Obviously that is after feeding. But it can be up to a few hours later, especially if they have feeding difficulties and they're taking in air when they're feeding, or they have tongue-tie issues. The ones that are slightly harder to decipher, I think, are silent reflux, colic, and other pain. So let's talk about silent reflux. Silent reflux is silent because they don't tend to bring anything up at all. An active reflux actually tends to be less painful. In an active reflux, they bring it all up, so the acid doesn't sit at the bottom of the esophagus. In a silent reflux, there is a weakness in the gastroesophageal valve. Some of the stomach acids come up and almost burn the bottom of the esophagus, and they are very, very irritable, these children. These babies tend to develop these symptoms mid-feed, so they tend not to eat, to drink so much. They become inconsolable. They're in a lot of pain if it's a severe reflux, and milder if it's a little bit. These are accentuated if they're lying on their back. They're better if they're 45 degrees. Also, they get sudden jolts of pain from nothing. They're just lying there happily, and suddenly, and they cry. That to me is often a silent reflux. They often have like a cough as well, and they have difficulties in feeding. This is slightly different, but also can concur with colic. Colic tends to be 20-30 minutes after a full feed, which you have to decipher from wind. And they pull their legs up, they're crying, they can be inconsolable as well. It's when the milk is in the upper gastrointestinal tract and there is a reaction there. There's a difficulty, there's a slowness in the absorption or a reaction to the milk in the upper gut. It tends to be worse between 6 and 10 p.m. Evenings tend to be worse. I actually don't know why that is, but you seem to see this pattern, and it tends to be, it's diagnosed as more than 3 hours a day in the evening, pain, drawing their legs up, very irritable, not helped by feeding, a nasty thing. The problem with this is you can have silent reflux and colic together, which makes it very difficult. Colic is a whole subject, which I'll talk about on another podcast, because each of these actually we can talk about with regards to what are the potential causes of them and how to resolve them, but I'll come back to those. Now, all of these have to be differentiated from pain, other pains, not just pain in the tummy. So the most common causes of pain or irritation is infection, viral infection, bacterial infection. Bronchiolitis is very common viral infection of a young baby. But the thing that you see in these situations usually is they have a raised temperature. So make sure you feel the back of baby's neck to feel whether they're hot, and then take their temperature. And if they have a high temperature, it's most likely to be an infection. With the other reflux, colicky things, there isn't. If baby has some sort of infection and has a raised temperature, it's very important to get them checked out as soon as possible. There are other causes for pain, like, for example, aspiration, when they've taken something into their airways, or other illnesses which are not infections. In those cases, when it's unknown and you don't know why baby is crying, you need to get them checked out as well. It's very important. So what we try and do is, because this baby isn't telling us, I'm sore here, actually a young child doesn't either, we have to decipher what's going on. Actually, in children who are slightly older, toddlers, they can be crying and irritable, and they can have a high temperature, but it's actually quite hard to decipher where the problem is. Especially, say, for example, if they've got a throat infection or tonsils, they don't tend to be able to say that, because they can't decipher where the pain is coming from until they get slightly older. So we have to work out where the struggle is coming from. The hardest thing for a parent, I think, is when a baby is inconsolable, when you cannot calm them down, because especially in a mother, there is a natural instinct to calm a baby down. And if you can't calm the baby down, especially with these babies with silent reflux and colic and other feeding difficulties, it can make you very, very stressed and anxious. And we tend to actually have to treat the parents as well, because they can be terribly stressed from the situation in practice. But anyway, for all of these things, it's good to get the baby checked out to see what is actually the problem if they're getting some of these repeated crying episodes. Ideally, a baby should feed, sleep, cry really when they're hungry, or when they're tired, but actually shouldn't be in pain. And if they are crying for long periods where you can't decipher what's going on, I think that it's important to get them checked out, either with the osteopath, who can decipher which of these areas and can hopefully treat them, or with the GP. Okay, I wish you well.